Of the tenets that are available to us through these lost texts, if we were to go through at least the 45 books that we're aware of, and hone all that information down into those 4 tenets, and I just shared those with you. The first one says there's only one of us here. We're unity by nature. The second one reminds us that that unity consciousness is moving collectively toward this rare moment in history. The third one reminds us that we have direct access to the creative forces of our world. And the last one suggests that the science of compassion may be the most ancient science that allows us to gracefully transcend the great challenges of our life with grace. Well, 2 of those tenets I'd like to develop further. One of those, it's the one that says there's only one of us here, that our consciousness is holographic in nature. The term hologram means different things to different people. Do we really understand the implications of what it means to live in a holographic consciousness? When I say the word hologram, what do I mean by that? Of the many definitions that we may choose for a hologram, perhaps one of the simplest and the most eloquent may be as follows: that a hologram is simply a pattern that is whole and complete unto itself, and at the same time, it's part of an even greater pattern that is whole and complete unto itself, while at the same time is part of an even greater pattern. Now, this pattern can be non-physical energy, or it can be very physical matter. The cells of your body are holographic in nature. One cell has all the information it needs to create another one of you. It is whole and complete unto itself, and it's part of an even greater pattern that you call your body. Okay? Consciousness works this way. We are many expressions individualized of a unity consciousness. And what that means, and this is the beauty of the hologram, any place in the pattern of a hologram where you make one little change, that change is mirrored throughout the rest of the hologram. If you make one tiny change, it's mirrored throughout the rest of the hologram. Perhaps a good example, this is a story that's told from the Spanish journals when the explorers were coming over looking for new routes into this world in the 1500s. One of the routes took them around the coast of South America, and the Spanish galleons that were making this journey, sometimes journeys took many months, up to a year, they set ashore for supplies in a place where the Spanish had never recorded being before, and they were met on the shores by the indigenous people of that area who apparently had never seen white people before, had never seen Western technology before. And fortunately for this particular story, one of the first men to meet them on the shore was the shaman of the tribe. He was the holy man. So here the holy man of the tribe meets the Spanish as they're coming ashore. They left the large ships out on the water and they came ashore in smaller rowboats. And however they communicated, in whatever language they were using, the holy man asked them, "Where did you just come from?" I mean, they've been here for years. They've never seen people like this coming up onto their shore. And however they communicated in return, the Spanish said, "We came on this little boat from that big boat with the wooden planks and the canvas sails out on the horizon of the ocean." And the holy man looked to where the Spanish were pointing, and he couldn't see that ship. The ship was there, and it was of a pattern that was so foreign to his frame of reference, it made no sense to his conscious recognition. He didn't recognize it. And as I hear this story, I often wonder, how many times does that happen in our world, in our lives? How many times do things happen right in front of us, and maybe we disallow it because it doesn't make sense in terms of our frame of reference? Is it possible there's a whole separate world going on here that we haven't recognized because we don't allow for it in our paradigm? Well, because this was a holy man, because he was a shaman, he was fascinated by the possibility that these people came from something that he couldn't see. So another individual may have dismissed it. The shaman worked with it. And eventually, what he said, in a matter of moments, he says, if I look out of the corner of my eyes and I squint just the right way and redefine the shape of my eyeball, I begin to make something out on the horizon. And in just a few moments, he taught himself how to see a pattern of matter that he had never been exposed to before. He taught himself to see that. That happened to him on the shore. Miles away was his village, and the people in his village didn't have the same experience that he had, on the one hand. And within just a couple of days, on the other hand, they too benefited from his experience because they then were able to see what was happening on the shores. How did that happen? They weren't witnessing with him on the one hand. The other hand, they learned through his experience. The term we use today is called collective resonance. And what it means to us is that every time one person chooses a new way to respond to the challenges of life, each time an individual chooses a new option, that person then becomes a living bridge for all the others who choose to follow in that person's path. It's not about imposing will on anyone. What it is about is that person now that chose a new way, that chose a new path, they have created a template of a new possibility very close to the consciousness of all others who choose to follow. And that template now becomes more accessible to the next and the next and the next. The shaman on the shore, he chose to see a new way, and through collective resonance, others benefited from his experience. This is the beauty of the hologram. If we have a pattern, perhaps it looks like a snowflake pattern, and that pattern is whole and complete unto itself and part of an even larger snowflake, which is whole and complete and part of an even larger snowflake. And there is one place in each of these patterns where there is a little pointed tip, and we take the tip off in one place of the snowflake. That tip no longer exists anywhere in the pattern. That's the beauty of the hologram. When a change occurs in one place, it's mirrored throughout the whole. It's mirrored throughout the rest of the system. What that means to us simply is this. Here we are on the threshold of a new millennium, creating a new paradigm, a new way to respond to the great challenges of life. We have lived in a world of polarity where we have hated and feared and judged and killed, and we've always had the tools to rise above that hate and the judgment and the fear and the killing. Each time one individual chooses a new way to respond, chooses something other than hate, chooses something other than retribution. That's a big one in our culture now. If you do something, you've got to get even. You've got to pay for what you've done. It's not right, wrong, good, or bad. It simply is a path, and there may be the possibility of a higher path. Each time one individual chooses that possibility, it makes it easier for the next and the next and the next. So we ask ourselves, are we choosing to carry across this bridge into the new millennium hate, judgment, warfare, and killing, or do we choose peace, forgiveness, compassion, and love, honoring all of the polarity that brought us to this moment? The hate, the killing, the judgment, the anger, the warfare has served us. It served us well. It thrust us onto a path so we would know ourselves in that way. And now we're invited to heal that path and to choose something new rather than judging the path, being angry at that path and moving on. That's the beauty of the holographic model of consciousness. That is why there's only one of us here. We're all going through that doorway together. No one is left behind. Everyone benefits from each choice that we make as we birth this new millennium. So when we talk about fractal patterns and when we talk about the principle of the hologram, these are not occurring in a vacuum. They're not occurring in empty space. They're occurring within the context of a broader field of information. That often is simply called the field. What we're talking about are the rules that allow energy and matter to function within the field that connects all things. And as we know those rules, as we begin to understand the rules of the field, and I'm assuming that most people watching this, that if you're seeing this, it is common knowledge that there is a field of energy that underlies all of creation. This is now accepted in mainstream science. It's no longer controversial that the field exists. In the year 2012, there was a consensus among scientists based upon experiments that were done at the CERN superconducting super collider in Geneva, Switzerland. An announcement was made that there is in fact a field that underlies our reality. Now, there's a lot of controversy around what the field means, what it means to us, where it comes from. All of the properties of the field are still being explored. But the fact that the field is there is no longer controversial. So I'm going to begin with that assumption. There is a field that connects all things. And the better that we understand the rules that govern that field, the better equipped we are to understand our relationship to the field and to apply those rules in our lives. All right? So that's the preface to what I'm sharing here. Two of the primary rules, there are others, but two of the primary rules that the people have asked about in these questions are the holographic principle and the fractal principle. So the first rule, the field is holographic, and the question comes up, what does that mean? You know, what is a hologram? And I think one of the best ways to maybe to understand this is let me define it first, and then let me illustrate what this means. In a true holographic system, every piece of the hologram contains all of the information about every other piece of the hologram. In a true hologram, every piece contains information about what's called the whole and every other point within that whole. Now that's a big concept. That's a huge concept. Let me help you maybe to wrap your mind around this a little bit in a fun way. When the term hologram first really came into the mainstream, it was back in the 1980s when the New Thought community was first emerging. And maybe you remember this. There were bookmarks that were coming out in New Age bookstores. Maybe you've got one today. I've used all of mine in illustrating what I'm about to share with you. I've destroyed all of my all of my bookmarks. But maybe you remember these. They were shiny strips of shiny material, narrow strips of shiny material. And when you would hold the bookmark in the light, the image in the bookmark would appear three-dimensional, as if it were hovering above your hand. And I remember very clearly there was one that was a rosebud. So that rosebud looked like it was a physical rosebud that you were holding in your hand. There were some pretty trippy ones that were out there. There was one with a dolphin jumping over the Great Pyramid of Giza. That was a very popular one. There was one that was the face of Jesus. It was very popular. There was one that was the image of Mother Mary with a shawl and her hands in prayer. That was a very popular one. So here's the point. And I used to be able to do this until I ran out of the bookmarks. If they were truly holographic bookmarks, you could take that beautiful bookmark with a pair of scissors and you could cut it in half. And then you'd take that half and you'd cut it into one of those halves, cut them into a bajillion pieces. And then you could take the smallest one of those pieces and even cut it again and put it under a microscope. And if it was truly a hologram, if it was really a holographic bookmark, in that fraction of a piece, you would still see the whole image of the rose or the dolphin jumping over the pyramid or whatever. And that's the point, because every piece has to contain the entire image. It contains all of the information on the whole, and this is why a hologram is so powerful. It's powerful for a number of reasons. One is that when we have a holographic principle in play, from one little piece of that hologram, we can learn a whole lot about the whole system without exploring the entire system, because the entire system is reflected in that whole. So that is important in terms of gaining knowledge about the system. But where this gets really practical, you and I function on the holographic principle. Your blood functions on the holographic principle. Your DNA functions on a holographic principle, and computers now are being built that function on this principle, and here's what I mean. The average human body has about 50 or so trillion cells in the human body. Each of those cells has a nucleus, and within that nucleus is the blueprint for your body, your DNA, and the genes that make up your DNA. Now think about this. If you introduce a change, a mutation, a healthy mutation in your body, or you introduce something in your body that helps you to heal on a genetic level, if that something had to go through every one of those cells in a linear fashion, one at a time, you do the math. I mean, if you took a half a second for each cell, 50 trillion times a half a second, I haven't done the math, but it's going to take some time. But you know that we don't work this way. When you create a shift, an energetic shift in your body through your choice of emotions and the techniques that you are learning to regulate, self-regulate your biology, heart-brain harmony, for example, heart-brain coherence, when you benefit from those, the reason it happens so quickly is because of this principle. Your cells don't have to adapt to change one by one by one by one. In a holographic system, when a change is made in one place, it is reflected in the whole. If that change is truly made in a meaningful way to a holographic system. There's a whole conversation that we can have about that, but I've just given you some examples. So this is the power of the hologram. The universe is holographic. This is how nature communicates information. Probably one of the most amazing examples that come to mind from this, beyond what I'm sharing with you, you've all heard of the 100th monkey principle. And this comes from a scientific study that was done from primates on a number of islands, and I believe they were in the Pacific. They were in the South Pacific. And the anthropologists were studying the habits of primates. In this case, they were chimpanzees. And what they found was that the chimpanzees were having problems finding food, and that they resorted to eating ants that were deep in the earth in ant hills, and it was hard to get to them. So there was one chimp that did something that had never been seen in any of the chimp communities on any of the islands in the past. He took a stick and he fashioned the stick as a tool, consciously, intentionally fashioned the stick as a tool, put the stick down into the anthill. The ants began to cling to the stick, and when he pulled the stick up, his tool allowed him to have access to those ants in a way that he'd never had before. So this was a pretty cool thing to do, but where the holographic principle comes in is that it wasn't long before the chimps on other islands with no communication physically, they weren't like swimming from island to island. They weren't radioing one another from island to island. But without any visible means of communication, chimps on the other islands began to do the same thing. They learned from the chimp that was innovative and tried something new. That is a beautiful example of the holographic principle. It didn't have to go linearly from island to island. One chimp figured out a new way to do things. It was in the field. It was in consciousness. And all of a sudden, other chimps began to access that consciousness. That is the power of the holographic principle. All right? One of the really fascinating things, and I'm going to address this briefly as we go through this explanation, is that our experience of time is holographic as well. Because time, there's nothing in physics that limits us from moving backward in time as well as forward in time. And there are scientific studies that are happening right now suggesting that we actually do this. When we experience a memory of the past, that a part of us is actually traveling back to that moment in the past. And the reason this is so powerful is because the experiments now are strongly suggesting that from this moment in time, we can go back into our past when we have had trauma, and that we can actually communicate with ourselves in the past to shift our experience of the trauma so that we're healing it in the present moment. Wow, if that isn't a mind blower, I don't know what is. Think about that. It means that if you are a child 50 years ago experiencing a traumatic event and you are feeling alone, if that child senses that there is an acceptance, that there's not a judgment, that the shame of that traumatic experience is being healed in that time, then there is a communication and a mutual healing. The child at that time is being helped as you've gone back into time, and you are being helped because now the trauma of your earlier self doesn't have the same meaning to your adult self. Tremendous studies being done around this. The point is, it's all possible because of the holographic principle, because the field is holographic, because time is holographic. So I hope I'm giving you a sense of what a hologram is and why it's so important. Now, in a hologram, information is stored as patterns, and those patterns are based upon a fractal principle. So now we're going to move to the second part of this. What is a fractal? And this is always interesting to me because people, when they think of fractals, they think of a particular kind of fractal called a Mandelbrot set. I'm going to show you what that is in just a moment. But in general, let me just address the definition of a fractal first, and then I'll give you some of those examples. A fractal is a pattern in nature. It's a fancy word for some people that describes a pattern in nature. And what scientists now know is that as complex as our world appears to be, it is actually based on a very few, just a handful of very simple patterns that repeat again and again and again, but they repeat on different scales. Here's what I mean by that. What you're seeing on the screen right now is electricity. And it is electricity following a preferred path where the resistance is the least. We've all heard this, that energy follows the path of least resistance. In the image you're seeing on the left of your screen, it's lightning in the sky following a path of least resistance flowing through the atmosphere. You can see the pattern. The image on the right is happening at a much smaller scale. This is a neuron in the human brain. It also is an electrical pattern, electrical energy following a pathway of least resistance that's designed to carry electricity. So the neuron is on a small scale, lightning's on a big scale, but you can see the similarity in the patterns because energy is fractal and energy follows fractal patterns. So what we say is that the neuron is a fractal of the lightning. If we understand the way the neuron functions and how energy follows the path of least resistance in the neuron, it gives us insight into how energy flows through the atmosphere and follows that path of least resistance. These are fractal patterns. It's the same pattern on a different scale. Same pattern on a different scale, and that's important. Now, another example that's common, and I've used this, is when we look, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, when we look at the way that electrons flow around the nucleus of an atom. So we say that the electrons have orbits around the nucleus of an atom. This is a physical model. That looks very similar to the way that moons move around a planet, or the way that planets orbit around the sun. But these are very, very different in scale. As you can see, the atom is very small. The moon's moving around another planet. In this case, these are moons moving around Saturn or Neptune. Neptune also is one of the planets in our solar system with rings. That's larger than the atom, but you can see it's the same pattern replicating. And then when we look at planets moving around the sun, it's the same pattern of things moving around things. All right. So what we say is the atom is a fractal of the solar system, or the way that the moons move around a planet is a fractal of the solar system, or maybe the solar system is a fractal pattern of the atom. Okay. So in principle, this is accurate. Now, this is the second question that came up. We now have a different sense for what the atom looks like. Again, I just want to reiterate this. What you're seeing here is the same pattern playing out on different scales. Now, we have a different sense. Technology now has given us deeper insights into what an atom looks like. And while this mechanical model, this Newtonian model, of an atom still works in terms of concept if we're going to, engineer and balance a chemical equation or something like that. It's not really the way that nature works. Now we know that the atom looks more like this. It looks more like pulsing fields of probability rather than physical things moving around a nucleus. So the question is, with this shift in how we see the atom, what does that mean to the way that we think of the other fractal patterns, of planets moving around a sun, or a solar system moving around, in a galaxy, the center of the galaxy? Well, this is where it gets interesting, even more interesting, because whether we're talking about moons moving around the planet or we're talking about planets moving around the sun, they are made of atoms. And now we know that those atoms look like this. So when we look into the night sky and we see our moon, or we look through a telescope and we see the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, what we know is we're not really seeing physical things, although they appear physical to us. What we're seeing are collections of what you're seeing on the screen. Pulsing fields of information that appear as solid to us. So what we're saying is it depends upon the perspective. On one level, on the quantum level, these planets and the moons around the planets and the solar systems actually are functioning on this level as pulsing fields of information. And on another level, depending on how we want to engineer them and how we observe them, they are the physical essence of what we see. This is one of the quandaries in physics, because the very famous double slit experiment done early in the 20th century was the first to pose this conundrum, this mystery, because it appears that quantum particles express themselves as waves of energy, which is what you're seeing on the screen right now, until they are observed, and the act of observing the wave collapses it into a particle that becomes the physical reality. So that's another mind blower, and I know you've heard me talk about it and other people talk about it in other programs. I won't spend a lot of time on it here. But the answer is the new perception of atoms as pulsing waves of probability, pulsing fields of probability. It gives us a deeper insight into the reality that we live in. But where this gets really interesting is when it comes to you and me. I mentioned a moment ago that the average human body has about 50 trillion cells, whatever an average person is. But each of those cells is made of about 100 trillion or so atoms. Every one of those atoms is not a static body, but it is a dynamic field of energy that is constantly emerging from the field and collapsing back into the field, number one. Number two, every one of those atoms is about 99.999999999% empty space. It means that you and I are less physical than we have been led to believe. We're mostly empty space. We appear physical because of the way our brains are perceiving the energy being given off by the atoms. So an atom, when you're talking about an atom, it's less of a thing in time and more of a place in space. And what that means is that you and I are less of a thing and more of a place in space-time. This is why your healing is possible in the way that it is, because your perceptions form the template for the way the atoms are going to express as they emerge and collapse into the field. If you like everything about you, you don't change your perception. If you are choosing a deeper state of healing, for example, or a healthier state of your physical being, or a healthier state of your emotional being, you are one of the rare forms of life, perhaps the only one that we know of on earth, with the ability to consciously choose to shift the way you perceive yourself so that that shift in perception forms a new template, a new blueprint for the way those atoms are emerging from the field to reflect your new perception of yourself. And the beauty is you don't have to know any of that. I'm answering these two questions and I'm sharing with you the science. But the beauty is you don't need to know that. And there are many really good teachers, really good books, spiritual practices that have been around for 5,000 years that invite us to hold a positive sense of ourselves. Rather than looking in the mirror and focusing on the imperfections, the illusion of the imperfections that you may see, the invitation is to look into that mirror and see yourself in the perfection of your highest vision. Now, people will say, Greg, isn't that lying to yourself? And the answer is no. This comes from a deep understanding of how the quantum field works. You've got to give the quantum field something to work with. If you're looking at yourself, focusing on what you perceive as the flaws and the imperfection, that's what you're feeding into the field. That's the blueprint that the atoms are going to adhere to as they are emerging back into the field to reinforce what your focus is. So when you focus on the image, on the vision, on an altered perception of what you choose to experience in your life, what you're doing, or in your body. The healing in your body is the example I'm using here, but this principle applies to many other things. When you focus on that, what you're actually doing is you are honoring your relationship with the field by giving it something to work with. You're giving it a blueprint, a template of what it is that you would like to experience. The key is, and this is the bottom line for me here, is that we must become in our lives what we choose to experience in the world. We must become the kindness in our lives if we want to experience that kindness from others. We must become the healing that we're asking our bodies to accomplish. And we become those things by assuming that perception in our conscious as well as in our subconscious mind. A lot of work out there from a lot of really good people helping us to do that. All right? So this is the key. Every atom of our bodies is constantly emerging from and collapsing into the field, following the rules of the field. And now you know two of those primary rules, the rules of the holographic principle and the rules of the fractal principle. Now, this isn't the end, because once we begin understanding the fundamental rules of the field, these begin to help us to understand our potential in the field. But the real beauty is, once we understand our potential in the field, what we begin to see is that we are not bound by the laws of physics as we understand them today. We're not bound by the laws of what are called classical physics, time and space, because in the holographic principle, it's possible to influence the healing and the health of our loved ones in the room next to us, in a home a mile away from us, or in a battlefield in the Middle East on the other side of the planet. And when we begin to accept the power and the responsibility that comes from our relationship to the field, these are deeply held secrets in the esoteric traditions that are not secret any longer, and why should they be? It's about you and me in the world that we live in. And I'll tell you, if we're ever going to embrace the deep truth of who we are and our potential in these fields, I can't think of a better time than right now, when everything that we know and value and cherish is up for grabs with competing agendas playing out in the world, trying to create different societies and different worlds than we've had in the past. And maybe that's a good thing. I think it depends upon the underlying values of the change. Why are people trying to implement? Why are governments? Why are corporations? Why are they trying to impose these changes upon the way we think of ourselves and our lives? Well, our conditioning is that we've been indoctrinated into a view of ourselves as flawed beings that are powerless victims of our external circumstances. And that certainly may be true if we choose to do nothing about the events that are unfolding in our lives. But in the ignorance of understanding our relationship to the field, many people feel that the only choice they have is to fight back. And when you fight back, that is one way of thinking. It typically creates more suffering for the people that can least afford to have that suffering. Buckminster Fuller, I think, said this the best. He says, "You're never going to change the world by fighting against the things you don't like." He said, "You want to change the world, find a new model that works better than the old model, and people will begin to follow that new model. The old model simply becomes obsolete and it falls away." I think there's a lot of truth to what Buckminster Fuller said. And what I'm suggesting in these kinds of videos is our world is changing, and there are a lot of reasons for the change. If you want to implement a positive, healthy, new way of thinking, begin to embrace the deep truth of who you are and live this in your life. And what begins to happen is you don't have to fight against the old models because they simply don't make sense anymore. People are pretty sharp, and they'll look around and they want to see who's happier, who's healthier, who has a deeper sense of well-being. And when you're that person in your family or your community, people will notice and they're going to say, "I want what you have. How did you do that?" And that is the opening for you to share these deep principles of where the spiritual traditions of our past meet the rubber of the road of life. It's where the rubber meets the road. So the spiritual rubber of our past meets the road of everyday life. And it doesn't have to be a deeply philosophical conversation. Once we understand the science, this is a place where science and spirituality come together in a really beautiful way. Once we understand the science, it becomes a lot easier to implement the principles in our lives.